Chapter 4. Konan. Konan stared across the open walkway and peered through the fortress's iron gate by the light of both moons. The quick moon, which grew full and then emptied over the course of a few weeks, waxed near full in the sky, casting a bright light. The slow moon was lower on the horizon. It never rose very high, instead traveling in a subdued arc to the south. Its half-crescent reflected a soft light, having started to wane weeks ago. Together, they cast mismatched angles of light across the camp. He leaned in the shadows of a dilapidated shanty that had been vacant for a year, but he knew others were doing the same, driven by a morbid curiosity to see what pathetic soul was destined to join them. The supply wagon that had arrived several hours earlier was unloaded and pulled around, leaving the courtyard open and empty. With any luck, they would be generous with bread for a week or two, but he doubted it. More intriguing was the delay in prisoner release. Konan would have expected them to shove the bedraggled man, whomever he might be, through the iron gate before the sun went down, so they wouldn't have to risk opening the gates in the dark. As with the incident with Donna, they preferred not to come out in force at night. There were too many violent prisoners, and they were too well organized into coordinated factions led by vicious men. Thordrin in the west camp, Selen in the central camp, and Scrap in the east camp. His sharp eye caught movement, and he heard the shuffling of feet and clinking of spear butts on cobblestone. He stayed still, a black shape in the shadows, but he saw movement around him as other miners perked up. The gate swung open, and a squadron of soldiers emerged. They moved in concert across the walkway and just passed the first row of shanties. Their steps hurried. One in the center had a slender body slung over his shoulder, which he dumped on the ground. The soldiers turned outward, glaring furiously at the prisoners, who seemed to emerge from every doorway and shadow. The squadron backed away, spears pointed out, and swaying with unspoken threat. And then they were back through the gate. It screamed with the metallic clank of locking mechanisms, the sound harsh in the night. If any of the gangs hadn't been paying attention, they would be by now. Curious, Konan edged closer, emerging from his hiding place on the edge of the central camp. With a few steps, he was in Selen's territory. He could hear others doing the same. The rustle of half-shoed feet and ragged, rough-spun cotton swept across the camp in a muted whisper. All eyes turned to the body. It was a girl. Dropped unceremoniously to the sandy ground, she lay at first like a rag doll, although he could tell her sparkling eyes were open as she stared at the starry sky. Konan sucked in a breath, then clenched his jaw. The tick on his cheek quivered. There were so few women in Tahai mines, and none so soft-looking as her. The leader of the central camp appeared. Selen. He swaggered toward the girl as if he were the one responsible for her appearance. "What have we here, boys?" he called out in a jaunty tone. "Finally, something fuckable." His men jeered and began circling. Konan counted 11 of them. They were like scavenger birds circling a corpse. The girl seemed to struggle to sit up. Her scrawny arms trembled visibly. Her chest heaved as she examined her surroundings, and Konan could see the subtle signs of growing panic. The slight widening of her darting eyes, the depth and speed of her gasping breaths, the stiffening of her posture. Her cheeks looked swollen and off-color, likely tender from a beating by the guards, and her forehead bled just on the edge of her hairline. Had she resisted arrest? She sobbed once, then nothing. Her eyes, at first glittering like the stars above, seemed to glaze over, and she went still, almost as if she were in shock. Surely, this soft creature hadn't resisted arrest. She had already given up. A stubborn, angry voice inside of him railed at her. Why didn't she scream or lash out? Did she really have so little fight? Weak, tender hearts didn't last in the mines. Konan knew. The circle of Selen's men tightened around her. One of them grabbed her wrist. She turned her hazy eyes upon him and brought her other hand up in a defensive motion. A churning wind tore into the group, seemingly from her. It twisted, picking up gritty sand in a wild, pulsing whirlwind the size of 2 men, then engulfed the man who grabbed her. The air shrieked and hissed, overwhelming his scream. He stumbled backward, his hand clutched to his throat, but the others advanced with a shout. The girl's hands flung toward each man, seeming to direct the windstorm, which crashed around her in a chaotic pattern. 4 more men fell, consumed and asphyxiated by the flurry of sand. 2 men ran. Konan watched as they sank namelessly into the crowd of prisoners. Selen, the burly gang leader who commanded the central camp, grabbed hold of her hair from behind and dragged her against his chest. He pinned her arms against himself with a nasty grin, and she yelped with more pain than Konan would have expected. Then he noticed the black bruising showing through a rip in her undertunic. Her ribs were broken, no doubt. Nevertheless, the girl kicked out, frantic, resisting Selen's grasp. Her colorful skirts, now marred with muck and blood, flailed about her legs. Then a wall of air slammed into them with a roar. Konan stumbled, but so did everyone else. 2 of Selen's men howled as grit ripped at their skin and pummeled their eyes. Even Selen hacked at the dust, tightening his grip around the girl's neck and using the other arm to cover his face. Konan tightened his face wrappings as he recovered his own balance. The prison was chaos. "She's a mage," someone cried. "Course she's a fucking mage," Selen growled, squeezing more tightly until the girl choked. The gale died down. He growled into her ear, loud enough for all to hear, his voice guttural with phlegm and sand. "One more summons, and I'll break your neck, witch." She lashed a leg out at one of Selen's men with one more bodily effort. Red with fury, the man groaned, then punched her in the abdomen. The girl screamed and doubled over, but she seemed to be fading fast in Selen's grip. He pulled at her corset strings with his free hand, and she pushed ineffectually at his fingers. The corset fell off, revealing the shape of her breasts, hanging loose under the filthy undertunic. Selen's men jeered. "Start her slow, boss." "No, hard and fast, so I can have a turn." Konan snarled with disgust. The girl was barely conscious, but he could see the tears streaming down her pale face. When she'd summoned her magicka, the bright glitter of her eyes had glazed to a terrifying cloudiness, a violent storm about to break upon them all. But now they were different. Dull. Blood foamed from the corner of her mouth, and she managed to utter a few quiet words. "Don't. Please." Her desperation was met with raucous laughter from Selen's remaining men, and one of them kicked her. They grabbed her and spread her out on the ground, then began ripping at her tattered skirts. With a deep sigh, Konan stepped out of the shadows and grunted a warning to the 4 men. He hadn't made a sound in so long, it seemed like an animal's growl, but it was the best he could do. They ignored him. He strode forward, revealing his tall stature and hooded cloak in the moonlight. One of the men glanced up, and a look of fearful recognition flashed across his face. Then he nudged Selen. The leader snorted with derision. "Little far from your camp, aren't you, boy?" He sneered, jutting a chin at his men and the surrounding crowd, his implication clear. "These are my men." "Stop," Konan signed, unblinking. He was painfully aware of how far he was from his shack, but he couldn't retreat now. He wouldn't. His glare encompassed not only Selen, but the entire circle of miserable prisoners. Few would join the man's ravaging, but even fewer would do a damn thing to stop it. Konan breathed the situation in slowly through his nose, shaking his shoulders loose. White rage and disgust flashed through his body like an incendiary flame. He was ready. Selin eyed his hand motions for a moment, then scoffed and turned back to the girl. He gestured to one of his men to keep an eye on Konan as he unfastened his own belt and crawled over the girl. "I think he said stop." That cocky voice. Konan guessed who it might be, but the origin of the voice was hidden. Thordran, gang leader of the West Camp. Thordran continued. "I don't fucking know, but I agree. I'd rather see you fuck a pig. At least it'd be small enough to feel your prick." This time, Selin's head snapped to attention, and his arrogant sneer twitched with doubt. He and his men turned toward the voice as one and began to stand. A white-handled knife flashed through the air and embedded in the eye of a man holding the girl's shoulder. He keeled backward and plopped into the sand. Thordran hooted as if it were the funniest thing he'd seen in months, and he and Konan rushed in together. Konan leapt over the fallen man and tackled another, rolling him off the girl and landing on top of him, his fists already flying. He broke the man's nose, then his jaw. He ignored the pain in his scarred knuckles. It was temporary. This man's pain was not. Feeling someone grab at his hood, he shot to his feet before the attacker could hit him. A knee clipped his chin, but Konan deftly flipped the man over his shoulder, grabbed his jaw, and broke the man's neck with a loud crack. Another swiped at him with a chipped rock blade, and he hissed as it sliced his arm open. He twisted the blade out of his attacker's hand and dislocated the man's shoulder, then broke his neck as well. The crack seemed to echo, and the chaos paused for a moment as Selin's men reevaluated him. He glanced around. Thordran had yanked his knife from the dead man's eye and was swiping at Selin's men in an acrobatic dance. His movements were so graceful, his grin so wide, he seemed like a court jester. Thordran howled with mad elation as he lunged into a man and opened his throat, then danced away. More of Selin's men rejoined the fray, seeming almost frantic to support their master in a time of need. But they died in moments. Konan jabbed another prisoner in the cheek, then smashed the heel of his palm into the man's nose. It snapped inward and upward, and the man dropped. Konan broke another's arm and tossed him aside. One of Selin's men stopped short, his chest heaving with terror as he looked up at Konan. Then he spun and ran. The only one left was Selin himself, and Thordran seemed to be toying with him. Konan steadied himself, willing the rage down to a controlled simmer. He knelt beside the still body of the girl and placed a protective palm over her, then looked up at the crowd with a territorial glare of suspicion. Satisfied that no more would attack, he turned his attention to her. The delicate skin of her neck was marred with red finger marks, and she was unresponsive when he touched her chin. He turned her head one way, then the other. Her nose wasn't broken, but both cheeks were marred by fresh bruises, and her eyes were shadowed with blackened rings. One was swollen shut. The whites he could see were a vermiculated pinkish red, and her gaze was nearly lifeless, but not quite. Relief washed over him. Thordran spun with a joyful grin of rage and unrestrained hatred, finishing his dance with a flip of his knife into Selin's calf. The other man fell to one knee with a yelp, his legs spurting onto the sand. Thordran kicked him in the chest, knocking Selin into the pool of his own blood. The West leader cackled as the man flung bloody sand aside. Cursing continually, Selin dragged himself backward, leaving a bright blood trail that shone crimson in the moonlight. Thordran prowled after him, sidestepping the mess so it didn't get on his boots, then pounced. He grabbed Selen's collar and leaned in close. You move, Selen, and I'll pull your innards out one by one. His disarming smile didn't match his cold, hard gaze. Then he winked. Didn't know you liked girls. All this time I was watching for a pig to come through the gates and give you and your boys a good time. I know you've been lonely. We can make a deal, Thordrin, Selen stammered. You can have her first. You can have her for all night, all week even. I'll take her when you're done. Thordrin seemed to consider this, glancing briefly at Konan and the girl, then smiled even wider. No. Selen paused, but then turned his expression into a sneer. You may have the West End, but you ain't in the West End, Thordrin. His voice grew louder. All these men watching, they're my men. You can't touch me here. Yeah, you must be right, Thordrin replied equably. With a mad smile, he trailed his blade across Selen's throat. A thin red line appeared wherever the sharp dagger kissed. Selen's sneer froze, and any confidence he had fronted melted away. I'll make it deal, Thordrin. Come on. I ain't never touched the West End. Thordrin's hearty laugh echoed through the night, a sound at odds with the tension in the prison. He leaned in closer. Call your men. Call for help. Go on. Selen's eyes shot desperately through the crowd, landing briefly on Konan and the girl, growing bigger as they did. Thordrin continued to encourage him. Ask for help, Selen. I think you need it. I'd hate to see you go down without a good fight. Selen took a deep breath. Men, take him! Take him now! He cried, his voice cracking. Nobody moved, although Conan's muscles had tensed in the preparation for another fight. He hovered over the girl, his heart quickening. He dared not pick her up until he knew the fighting was done. Thordrin took a casual look around, then leaned even closer to Selen's ear. I think you're out of luck. The whisper barely reached Konan. Then kill me, replied Selen, his voice ragged with despair. Thordrin chuckled. Again, his mirth didn't really meet his glittering green eyes. So easily? Selen shuddered and wet himself. The other man looked up and shouted to the watching prisoners. This girl is mine. Konan grunted to get his attention, then signed. And mine. Thordrin shot him a measuring glance, then a disarming smile. You like her too? That's fine. We can share. Konan scowled and pointed at Selen. And him, he signed. Thordrin's grin widened. He seemed to understand Conan's meaning. He's mine. He choked Selen with one knee, leaning heavily upon him so the central camp leader couldn't move. Sliding his knife down the man's chest, he popped the man's damp pants open with the blade and tickled the skin all the way down, leaving a meandering trail of blood from neck to groin. Selen groaned, a pathetic sound, and begged for mercy. But Thordrin's merry expression didn't change, his green eyes remaining locked with Selen's. The knife sliced cleanly through, leaving a stump. Blood spurted all over the sand. Selen screamed.